Well, I want to welcome everybody to the Virtual Parlor Chat this evening. My name is Catherine Hughes. I'm the Executive Director of the Morris-Jumel Mansion in Upper Manhattan, more specifically on the edge of Sugar Hill and Washington Heights. And I am going to facilitate our conversation this evening with John Reddick. First, I am going to pull up an PowerPoint and get us going. Okay. So tonight's virtual parlor chat is called Inspired by the Harlem Renaissance, A View from the Heights. And we are going to be hearing from John Reddick. I'm going to introduce him in a minute. We want to welcome everybody to this virtual parlor chat that we have on the third Wednesday of every month. You will have about 30 minutes of a presentation and then about 30 minutes of a discussion with the opportunity to ask questions. You can use the Q&A function on your screen to log in those questions. You can do that at any time. We will be monitoring that. We have Presley Rodriguez, who is on as our tech this evening. Thank you, Presley. And she will be monitoring those questions. This is being recorded and will be available on the Morris-Jumel Mansion website and our YouTube channel. Here are some upcoming events that we'll have at the mansion. On June 1st, please join us for an artist talk with Bruce Katz. He is going to be talking about his exhibition, Past Present, which is currently up in our temporary gallery. And this is a really fantastic photography exhibit that Bruce has done, looking at the land that has been a part of the Morris-Jumel Mansion over time. Then we have a double entendre concert, a Baroque music concert, June 8th and 9th. That is available on our website. You can sign up and register for these events on our website, and they're all free. So we want to make sure you know that. And on Saturday, June 15th, we are going to have a wonderful book reading. The book is called Hamilton Heights and Sugar Hill. This is by author Suisa James, and we are very excited to have her join us. So that's at 2 o'clock on June 15th. And then finally, June 27th at sunset, we're going to be playing the movie Rio in the park. So check those out. Finally, our last event that we want to highlight is our signature event. Annually, we have the Morris-Jumel Mansion George Washington Dinner. That is on Sunday, July 14th this year, so Bastille Day. We have a French theme of liberty, equality, and brotherhood, the shared values of France and the United States. And we are very excited about this. Please go on to our website to find out more information. That's morrisjumel.org. Tonight, we are hearing from John Reddick, who is an architect and historian, and he is a founding member of Harlem Pride. I want to give him a little bit of an introduction here because John has been very busy over the years doing a lot of work. Through Harlem architecture and history, John's been using his knowledge of history and architecture to lead tours that connect the exhibition, the Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism at the Met, to the creative energy that has shaped the Harlem community throughout history. Originally from Philadelphia, John was educated at Yale's School of Architecture. He studied under influential professor and architectural historian Vincent Scully. In New York City, he initially worked at firms focused on architectural preservation and rehabilitation. Later, he joined the design office of the Prospect Park Alliance, where he was drawn into the field of landscape architecture. John followed that by working for Harlem's Abyssinian Development Corporation, a community-based organization that was then headed by Karen Phillips, who introduced him to work on public projects. Tonight, John is going to take us on an imaginative tour through Harlem, where we can hear, see, and feel the influence of the writers, artists, musicians, and thinkers who created the Harlem Renaissance. This presentation and conversation with John will focus on a variety of Harlem players, from Paul Robeson and his wife, the scholar and author Eslanda Goode Robeson, jazz artist Sonny Rollins, and the late creative visual artist Faith Ringgold, among others. The Morris-Jumel Mansion and the beauty of its surrounding park made residing in the area an attraction for generations of aspirational African Americans, situated as it is at the crest of Harlem's famed Sugar Hill. And with that, I would like to invite John to share his screen, and he is going to tell us all about the influence of the Harlem Renaissance. Welcome, John.
Welcome. Are we on the full screen? Is everything good?
Well, let's move you to share your PowerPoint. Awesome.
Okay, is it up? Very good.
Yes, you are.
Well, I want to welcome everyone this evening, and part of tonight's discussion is to really riff off a really spectacular show that's up at the Metropolitan Museum, the Harlem Renaissance, transatlantic modernism. And there's a lot of players in the exhibition, and their work or their focus really sort of shows Harlem in a certain time period that we've all come to know as the Renaissance. And I came to New York starting in the 60s, moved here in the 80s. And there's a kind of energy about Harlem that I always sort of see as like a brand. And it's a brand greater than Chanel to me. And it speaks to people in a lot of different ways. But all of this really gets started in the initial period of the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the things interesting in the exhibition, this is a work by William H. Johnson called Street Life. And what was really happening, if you think of the African Americans that were coming from the South to live in New York, there's a kind of mix that's coming along that really is transatlantic. People from Mississippi who maybe have known about the slave trade from Africa to Mississippi might not have realized it also touched base in Brazil or Haiti and these other places. And so now there's enough of a Black intelligentsia trying to really educate the Black audience through various means, through the writing, through film and painting, about the other aspects of Africans throughout the diaspora. And so I love this painting because, I mean, they show really kind of street life, well-dressed, sort of like on the edge of their time in terms of look and appearance and sort of self-awareness. And these are really the people that become the voice and the audience for the new Negro that's being cultivated in the community, but also really is having this transatlantic influence, which the show really kind of shows how once it's sort of has a center here, people are coming to see it, but it's innovating the music, it's innovating a variety of other aspects of not just New York life, but the life of people of color globally. Here to the left, you see a picture of Paul Robeson. He was in the play and the film Emperor Jones, and in the film and play Emperor Jones. And it's the same time period in the 30s, there's a production at the Lafayette Theater, which is on 7th Avenue, and by Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, called Haiti, which is talking about the liberation of Haiti and Toussaint Overture. But when I first saw this picture of Paul Robeson, it's a Stieglitz photograph. It's a classic image of him, and I see the brocade and the uniform, and I'm thinking, oh, it must be Toussaint Louverture that he's replicating in this play and film. And Robeson would actually come to live on the at 409 in the neighborhood of Morris-Jumel. In the film, you see him sort of taking on the very image that we would associate with Toussaint Louverture and his French connection, in the sense of how he would dress and present himself as a military leader. But in the play Haiti, it really is focused on Toussaint Louverture. And someone like Jacob Lawrence, who's coming along, who's now of the age of Sonny Rollins and some of those players. He's not of the Harlem Renaissance. He's really sort of learning from the Harlem Renaissance as a student and a young person. He sees the play in 1933. There's very few, the film in 1933. There's very few images of African Americans in film, and so to have Paul Robeson in this film at that time, and the audience was huge, and people are turning out for it. So he would have probably seen the film, thought about it, but when he went to see the play Haiti, it's very contradictory to what the movie had been in terms of Emperor Jones. Even to me, when I finally saw the Emperor Jones movie, beyond the images that have been sort of promoted, it really is like he's doing the same thing that colonial powers had done before to native populations. He's using superstition and the threat of violence to keep the country under control. And it's nothing like what Toussaint Louverture life was like. And so you can imagine Jacob Lawrence, having seen both of the film and the play, seeing Toussaint Louverture as the hero. So now he's a very young player. He's in his teens, going to his early 20s. And the first people he starts to document are people like Toussaint Louverture, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. This is nothing that he would be getting in public school. It's something he's really getting from the educators and the communicators of his own race. I find it interesting that Robeson, in living at 555, his view out the window wouldn't be much different than the view you're seeing in this photograph of the Morris-Jumel Mansion. You get a sense of how it's sitting in the landscape, even though there's development coming around it. You sense the shoreline to the east, what it must have been like to have those broader views, how you could watch the navigation of ships or boats along that river, or Washington could send a runner to the other side and watch what's going on on the Hudson River. But Paul Robeson's family also had a history that goes back to this period. He had a great grandfather who had supplied baked goods and serviced the continental armies of George Washington. So he would have not just the story of Jumel and Washington having this house as a headquarters, but you also would have an African-American story that paralleled the time period that would then probably only be uniquely his or his family. It wouldn't have been a story maybe that there was global awareness of. And so in the end, he's seeing the ironies of both the roles he's playing, how African-American life is projected, but also in the context of like history and place. And so it's not hard to believe he's seeing that dichotomy in terms of space and occupying the neighborhood. He also would have looked at the building as a traveler to Washington and other places and seen how much this first portico on the Morris-Jumel Mansion really set a trend in terms of prominent buildings in America. And so to see the White House to the number of columns and sort of the whole projected front is very little change from the way you see the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And so all these things in the consciousness of African Americans who could travel, who had the opportunity to see other comparative parts of American life, whether it's architecture, film, or art, they're starting to sort of pull together a storyline and a sense of how we might look at our own history in the context of the environments that we are living in. And so back to Jacob Lawrence. Like I said, he was taking classes at a studio just down on Edgecombe Avenue in the 140s. Augustus Savage was having programs for young people. That's Jacob Lawrence in the white sweater there, the second from the left. And he's being inspired by these stories that he's hearing from his educators or talks or plays like the Haiti play. So here's a series of panels he's doing in 1938 to 1940, focused on Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, but he's also looking at his own generation. And I think one of the great things about the show for younger people is this environment, like I said, has now been branded as a sort of global identity, and each generation, how they occupy the community, how they interact with other players. There's an interest in seeing how it would be redocumented today. So if you're a writer or a painter, you're no different than Jacob Lawrence in terms of navigating Harlem. And as a photographer or a writer, you have a chance to sort of give another window of another time to the community. And so these people are being inspired by their time and sort of cultural touchstones of the past, and it's still coming forward. Here you can see he's showing like a train station and the trip north. The numbers of people is predominantly Black group, hovering at the gates for these different cities, Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. And so again, he's capturing his time, but it's reading to me a generation later in a different way, but also putting my face into that storyline and images and things that did not exist for him as a young man. But also, you have to look at Robeson, and his wife went on to study anthropology, but she initially had been an actress when they first met. And this is an image of her in a film called Borderline. It was actually filmed in Europe in 1930. They were world travelers. She wrote about travel to Africa and the different Black publications, or giving an overview of a traveler if you were navigating Africa, intellectually places you might go, the nature and character of those communities. So again, they're traveling and bringing back to their community or potential audience, not only encourage them to go, but be an informative traveler, an informative person in terms of knowing the culture. You can see Robeson and their son and his wife sing along Central Park, not unsimilar to their, they're living uptown and being near some of the other parks, what was then called Colonial Park, which is Jackie Robinson Park. Today, there's a whole line of seating and overlook if you were to go down Edgecombe Avenue from the Morris-Jumel Mansion. That very much mimics the sort of where they're sitting along the edge of Central Park. And so there's a kind of sophistication, a sense of like self that maybe these people would not have had in Southern communities that New York is really giving to them in terms of themselves in the community, and navigating a culture now that's getting real prominence in a global way. And this photograph's in the show. It's a Vandersea, but you can see, despite it being Mrs. Robeson, in this picture, it's a local couple who looks just as glamorous and just as elegant in terms of how they're turned out, their sense of self-possession. And so it's not just famous people who are navigating and looking a certain way. This is understanding of presentation and how you carry yourself, the access to resources in navigating a community architecturally in a way that's just as distinctive as other places. And I always think of people coming from the South and say living at 409 Edgecombe or 555. And you realize that some of them are coming from places where even the governor's never been on an elevator or sort of lived the kind of urban life that they're experiencing. So there's a kind of exhilaration to be living on the 2000 block of Madison or Fifth Avenue in ways that you couldn't even predetermine what it would be like for the players, but how magical it must have been. I mean, it's magical for me just to even look at this photograph and feel the sense of self-possession and the sense of control over their lives that maybe these players would not have had in other communities. And so one of the interesting players, the artist who just recently passed, Faith Ringgold, always talked about the joy she had in growing up in Harlem. And she says she and Sonny Rollins are born just 31 days apart in 1930. And here both of them images of them as teenagers. I think Sonny Rollins is about 14 in this photograph. She's pretty close to that. And she talks about just being in the midst of other people that rose to fame, the sense that that was possible, where other places you would never sense there was a path to get there. Harlem, you could see people who had success, you could approach them, you could engage with them in ways that even spur your own creativity. And she talks about both him and her family gradually inching their way up Edgecombe Avenue from the sort of flats in central Harlem to be part of what was now becoming legendary for those players who could manage to live on Sugar Hill. But like she said, it was all the art was all around them. So Aaron Douglas lives at 409. She talks about seeing him, seeing his work. This work here, the evolution of Negro dance, is in the Harlem YMCA. It was in the billiards room of the Harlem YMCA. And so we realized it was made for just the general public to interact and see. And his graphic style was something that shows up in a lot of the publications. He did illustrations for Crisis magazine and other magazines that were sort of the natural publication for the African-American community, not only in Harlem, but throughout the United States. And so even the Y was, if you know of the Green Book, would have been considered one of the very high-end places for people to stay. Conferences that were coming to New York that were African-American conferences or gatherings, they would engage, the full facility to have those events. In the lower level, the little theater of the YMCA is where Cicely Tyson first performed. The older Y across the street, all of the entries to the Harlem Renaissance, people like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and those players stayed at that Y across the street. So you start to see this kind of synergy of overlay of history and use that goes from generation to generation. And the exhibition helps you kind of understand that. But in certain ways, I hope it gives young people the opportunity to see their place, to tell their story, and make some of these connections as well. And this mural is another mural by Aaron Douglas, Slavery Through Reconstruction. It's actually in the exhibition. It's from 1934. And these were done for the 135th Street Branch Library, which is now known as the Schomburg Center. But it was a circulating library. Schools in the area, this was the library they would have come to. They actually had a curator for the library that when she studied to be a librarian, she was really focused on bringing immigrant groups into the American culture. And initially she was at the Seward Street Library in the predominantly Jewish Lower East Side, and she used their traditions of celebration and understanding of their community to help make clear some of the aspects of American democracy and cultural life. When she graduated, she was actually appointed to be a librarian at the 135th Street branch, and she saw the neighborhood was changing, and she was actually the first to engage an African-American a librarian for the facility. It became the cultural hub of all the Harlem Renaissance life in terms of speakers and exhibitions. And so again, it even cultivated the Schomburg collection, which became a research collection that's now housed in the adjacent, more modern building. So all these players are not only engaging in their thoughtfulness in terms of their own points of view, but they also have a natural audience within the community. It's being supported on all different fronts. But also was the currency of the times in terms of the music, the evolving music culture, which the artist talks about a lot. Faith Ringgold talks about, it was all around her. She saw Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Ella Fitzgerald. Many of these musicians were not only performed here, but lived in the community. They were neighbors, not just artists. And so in a certain way, they're making success and the road to success something visible to younger people. It wasn't mythology in a distant way. It was a way to really start to connect, engage. She talks about Miles Davis and these other players of her generation also being in the neighborhood and being able to interact. And I love this painting by William H. Johnson, the exhibition, because you see like the way the dancers being sort of flung around, and that her legs and his legs are hardly you have to sort of spend a minute to figure out who is where in terms of the body motions, which is not very different from the photograph to the left. And so the sense of syncopated jazz music, it's evolving into other forms of dance and rhythms. All that currency is not only happening in Harlem, but it's catching the fire of artists and writers who are writing and painting and filming and documenting these unique things. So you could say the same about the hip hop period in Harlem and other periods that are current that really haven't been as well documented in terms of images and the sort of base relationships to Harlem. You think about the film Paris is Burning and the club scene in terms of dance and performance that exists there. There's some photography, but there's yet to be a real culture that looks at those physical places and brings those back into the currency of the times. And so there's a chance here, if you realize the value of the Harlem culture, to actually make an imprint even today in terms of how people see its transition from this earlier period through the cultural life that's actually going on. And Miles Davis talks about in his biography having met Sonny Rollins and hanging out with his crowd at Sugar Hill. And so that's already a definable group, an engaged artistic group that had older players that would attract the young musicians to the area. And a lot of you who live in Sugar Hill or lived here over the last couple of decades will recall St. Nick's Pub, and sort of knowing its life for me, I just knew it as this jazz club that was unique to my time, and I had no idea until I started doing some research into Harlem's Black and Jewish culture in the ragtime period, that it was originally a club run by a pianist and composer named Lucky Roberts. It was called Lucky's Rendezvous. And all these players hung out together. The image I have of Lucky Roberts, he's there with Willie the Lion Smith, the gentleman in the hat. This is a out photo from Great Day in Harlem. You see Maxine Sullivan as the singer. So these people are all playing and being engaged between generations. So it's not just the idea that Miles Davis and Sonny Rollins are in the 40s making their life. They're really on the shoulders of this generation that's still navigating Harlem, still providing work and engagement and tutoring to players, younger players in the community. It's Sonny Rollins is in the picture, this picture here, just to the right of the steps there. But you can imagine this was a day call. When you see the movie Great Day in Harlem, they talk about the call for this photograph was 10 o'clock in the morning. And the joke was that most musicians didn't know that there were two 10 o'clocks in a day. They knew 10 at night, not 10 in the daytime. And so people like Duke Ellington's not in this. There's some players that are not even in this photograph. So to see the range of this many like artists who were instrumental in the jazz community still available for a 10 o'clock call in New York means they lived here, they had proximity to the neighborhood. And so that was a wealth of talent and engagement to allow the next generation to really build and connect to another generation of players. This is an image from 1959. And so it's interesting, Sonny Rollins, he was starting to, like you said, Miles Davis was an admirer of his work. He was like one of the young Turks that's starting to get attention. And he started to have a lot of issues. He had drug arrest, he had a heroin addiction. And when he got out of jail, to get himself clean, although I really felt he had to separate in a while, so get away from things. He went to Chicago and lived for a while. But when he came back, he was trying to really reinvent himself and his music. And in a consideration of his neighbors, he would practice at night on the Williamsburg Bridge. And there he really found a new voice in terms of his music, a new camaraderie with another group of musicians. And the Bridge album came out very successful in 1962. This is a photograph afterwards, sort of recapturing where he was on the bridge. But Faith, who knew him in the 80s, did this tribute to him in a quilt. And so she's showing him on a bridge. And you'll see in her work, a bridge plays a large part in some of her images of Washington Heights. But here, the bridge, even though it's a physical thing, it's also about bridge building, and in terms of like looking at Sonny Rollins and how he's bridging one aspect of his life to a different aspect of his life. And so it has a metaphor for both the structural bridge, but also the spiritual transitional bridging between phases of one's life. And for Faith Ringgold, once she lived up in Sugar Hill and visiting friends who had access to the rooftop, she did a series called Tar Beach in the 80s. And the bridge she's highlighting as part of her skyline, her late night fascination, is the George Washington Bridge that you see, the sort of arc and the angel riding behind them, playing cards and having activities on the roof. And here's another one which she calls Dancing on the George Washington Bridge from that same series. And so the fact that like in the nighttime, in the evening, that this would be an illuminated structure that had a sort of magic, a physical magic against the natural backdrop of nature, and is something that was distinctive to her neighborhood experience that she wanted to bring to bear, that really localizes the engagement of the figures. She's not so different than Lin-Manuel Miranda, whose first play In the Heights, also in this stage set, had an image of the bridge, and he highlights it a lot in the movie. And he's a local kid who's actually risen to great heights by actually looking at his own environment, his own culture within the neighborhood, and presenting that to a broader audience. Even in Hamilton, you get a feel for the era. He actually spent time in Morris-Jumel and the Hamilton Grange to get a sense of like just the physical space and how people might have navigated, or what it would be like to be in the room where it happens, to understand the scale and the intimacy of those relationships. And that's all still there for someone to come back and riff off of in another generation, to look at his take on the neighborhood and its history. And each generation brings another eye, another perspective based on what's really moving them within their lifetime. And this is an Archibald Motley painting called The Lair, and a kind of hangout. A lot of the large apartment buildings in Harlem, like 555 and 409, maybe you were not as wealthy or as well off as Thurgood Marshall or some of these other players living in the building. Maybe it's your family all kind of pitching in to get a bigger apartment, but those big apartments were also places where a lot of people had rent parties and engagements where they had enough space to really have people come in, pay, have music, and have other kinds of entertainment in this space. But it's not very different than going to Marjorie Elliott parlor concert at 555. And I found this photograph online, but imagine painting that image. It wouldn't be very different in certain ways in its coloration and sort of illustration of the space as the Archibald Motley painting, but it would be telling a contemporary story of how people came. There's a real diversity in her audience. And if you go to her apartment, you get a sense of what the rent parties were like, the way her apartment is laid out, the intimacy of the space, the sense of engagement with the artist. And so these are aspects of the Sugar Hill life that still exists and still are there to be translated and looked at by another generation. They're really immediate to us. Now, Faith Ringgold just passed away about a month ago, and actually the New Yorker, on its May 6th edition, used her image from the bridge as the cover to their magazine. They have a long history of using artists for their covers, and here's a Faith Ringgold a couple years before in 2022, image of hers that they used for a cover. But you still see she's a contemporary image of music, but she's still having the same vibe and excitement she's reflecting in that woman that she must have had at the Savoy Ballroom watching. It's a different dance, it's not jitterbugging, but she's showing the joy and the engagement and the energy of dance, and the association with musicians is bringing forward a certain magic of the life she experienced, and her camaraderie with people like Sonny Rollins, the intimacy of their engagements, the bridges of their life experiences and stuff, having a legacy in both their work and their human relations. And so I really encourage people, if you thinking about Morris-Jumel in the context of history, I'm only recently finding out that Madame Jumel engaged Anne Northrop who was the wife of Solomon Northrop, whose memoir, 12 Years a Slave, documented his experience of being captured, taken to the South, and how he had to fight to get away from the owners that had taken him, and how his wife, working for Madame Jumel, stabilized the family, her bringing her kids with herself. She was hired away from a hotel in Saratoga Springs for her cooking skills. And so there's another more nuanced story about African-American experience that's come forward in a movie that's engaged people's lives, but there's also more in that dialogue and that story, and rethinking, visiting the house and thinking about how that period might reflect on some of the aspects of history and issues today. And so I take this, this is a silhouette done of Madame Jumel that was done when she was on a trip to Saratoga Springs, and it's from 1843. And the silhouette was sort of a romanticized way of portraiture. Here is very much more detailed than you see in most silhouettes, in that they're giving her an environment that she's being set in terms of how they render the rest of the room. But I find it very interesting in 1920, for the production Emperor Jones, Eugene O'Neill's stage production, they use silhouette a lot to engage really sort of difficult aspects. So there's a lynching and some other things that are portrayed in the play. And some places they really pull out and sort of do high contrast lighting. So you're really seeing the story and the sets in sort of silhouetted manner. Not unlike how Aaron Douglas is illustrating Emperor Jones in this sort of this print. It's almost like a silhouette cutout of the character in this sort of tropical environment that would have been Haiti, that's sort of been replicated for this story. So again, there's a currency in that history, of re-looking at an art style that you might think is past, that actually becomes contemporary in thinking. And so someone, a contemporary artist like Kara Walker, has used silhouette in a very strong and contrasting way against historic documents, or a more enlivened life that sort of gives another dimension to what silhouette can express in terms of the human engagement. But that's the old format, having a very contemporary life through looking at storyline, looking at artistic traditions, and trying to bring them into the contemporary fold. And one of the last pieces in the exhibition is this, The Block by Romare Bearden, which is looking at Lenox Avenue between 131st and 132nd Street. The block is still intact architecturally. He's got scoped the block from an apartment in Lenox Terrace, where he had a friend, writer friend who lived there. So from his terrace, you could kind of see that block line, and looking at who occupied the block. There was still a liquor store when I first moved there in the first building. On the corner there, it's now a restaurant, still has signage that's large, that sort of replicates in certain ways this. In my walking tour for the Metropolitan Museum, we actually took our cell phones and walked along the block to get the full outlay of the block, but also to pick up the noises of the street, which Romare Bearden supplements the imagery by having a recording of the street noises, the music playing, the banter that's going on in the street is also, he sees as part of enlivening the real experience of the block. And so I leave with this collage of the area around Morris-Jumel Mansion, and really encourage young people, creative people, to think about how to discover your own block, how the intermix. I see it in the architecture, and I can read time and development through the physical architecture. That's one lens. But as a writer navigating space, or a painter, or someone looking at the neighborhood, there's still a rich story in the neighborhood to be told. And I really encourage you to think about it more. Go see the exhibit at the Met, and then think about creative ways that you can be relooking at Morris-Jumel, Sugar Hill, and your life here, and express it in ways that the artists did in that exhibition. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, John. That was incredibly detailed and really complicated in so many ways. All those different influences. I am struck by the energy that you feel, around. Now, maybe that's city energy, but it feels particular to our little neighborhood that Morris-Jumel is in. It just, it feels like there are, when you look out at the people in the park hanging out, you see so many different people doing different things,
And then to look at the environment, I mean, you think about Sylvan Terrace, where else would you see that array of buildings that really make a block? I mean, it's like there's a stretch of uniformity there, and the fact that it's lasted, that it's from another time period, is like a unique window. And so maybe kids from the neighborhood have walked down that street to go to school or come from the Seatown grocery store or whatever it is. Like there's a storyline that they can find the magic in that storyline. There's something that other people will see in other places or other kind of connectivities, and how you came from maybe the first time you were aware of coming up from the grocery store, you could even take those steps and all of a sudden just be able to write about the wonderment of seeing that block, then going down that street to a cobblestone block that still exists, streetscape, and imagine what wagons sounded like on the cobblestone or whatever. Even if you're reading in school some book about another time period, there's aspects of what that writer's talking about in terms of the physical city that you're still engaging with. And so I feel those things are there. I've always been very fortunate in terms of just being curious. And so I just encourage people to be a little more curious about their neighborhood and the wonder of its riches, and how can we engage and look at these different stories and tell them in different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I was people can ask any questions now at this point. Please throw those into the Q&A, and we can have Presley gather those and share them. But I have always wondered, since I arrived at Morris-Jumel, about Paul Robeson's connection and how deep that is, like with his great-great-grandmother having supplied bread to Washington's army, and his feeling of connection to the house.
Obviously, you must have had some, because I mean, to decide to live in its vicinity, and he had a sort of richness of his own personal heritage that overrode whatever was going on in sort of the cultural expression of what that heritage was. He knew, as an African-American individual, there was a legacy to the past that maybe everybody else wasn't telling, but he knew it was personal to his family and diversified his understanding of American life in a certain way. And so even the Madame Jumel's story with Mrs. Northrop, you might assume one storyline if you're just casual engager, but it has a much richer and more nuanced storyline, good and bad, about relationships and navigating the culture of your time to get something that's personal to you accomplished, and benefiting another generation, another player, through engagement with other people.
Well, and I would say that is where the evolution of the Morris-Jumel is happening. We are moving away from the very narrow interpretation of the house and its history, away from just George Washington, and his army, and really expanding the story so that Paul Robeson is part of the story, so that Ann Northup is part of the story of the house. The people who were enslaved in the house are a part of the story now.
First of all, in my generation growing up, I know more African Americans named Washington than Grover Washington is a much more common name. It's like you don't, when you hear the name Washington, hark back for generational status by saying I'm a Washington, because like almost, every other Black family is a Washington. And so it'd be interesting. I mean, so the whole aspect of like, the family legacy and trying to hold on to those names for prestige. And there's also other people who have taken that name and given great prestige to the name that reverberates much more to the contemporary audience than George Washington. So I just say you should mount a show about all the Washingtons.
We have a question. Thanks for the interesting and informative talk. Reminds us to look up and around while walking in the neighborhood. Could you comment on the legacy of that period on the music and art scene today? I think you talked a little bit about that, but could you say more?
Well, I'm not a musicologist. I'm one of these people, I don't like to talk about things I don't know. I can talk about my curiosity. And so my curiosity, I really am fascinated by looking at hip hop music and then going back and looking at when schools took music out of the school. So if you look at, say, the Sonny Rollins generation or the Dizzy Gillespie generation, all their biographies, he said, we had to learn an instrument in school. I picked the clarinet, then I went to the saxophone. I started out with the piano. It was part of their education to be engaged with music. And then you could probably look about around the same time they took music out of schools in New York. Kids who wanted to make music had to figure out a way to sample and do other things to make music. So there was another genius in that whole hip hop, the whole figuring out legally what you can take and sample and make music. To me, that's a quilt of music. And so there's a genius there. There was an audience. And so that's not my generation, but there's a whole story there about how they used the parks to make music and tapped into the light pole to blast it. No one's doing, I haven't seen any paintings of that or any, writings about it. There might be some out there, but there's a wealth of within the neighborhood what parks meant to the people, the young people of that generation, how they used it, how they were programmed and sort of engaged their possibilities to make music and all of that's the story that's still untold that's for someone else to say. So that's why I really do feel like certain generations, I feel like I'm a bridge builder between generations, but I don't claim to know or sort of set down the gauntlet. I set down the gauntlet, but maybe I won't say how it has to be described. I think there's some richness there and some wealth there that could be carried forward in looking at all these different phases of the environment that you're in and telling the story. And Harlem I think there's an interest globally in knowing Harlem's story. And so I hate to see it peter out, just because people think we're on a different agenda. Even if the agenda is different, there's a story that strings these generations together.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that person said thank you for the helpful reply. Then we have someone else asking, she says, wonderful, too brief presentation. Thank you. This might be too off topic, but what were the Jewish immigrant experiences impacts on the African-American Renaissance in Sugar Hill, Harlem, and Washington Heights? Lin-Manuel Miranda makes a reference to this in the Heights.
Well, I'm working on a book.
Oh, does this give you an entree to something?
Yes, for almost a decade now, from the point of when I was engaged about it as an idea, looking at Harlem's Black and Jewish music culture from the ragtime period, which I compare to the hip hop music period because it sounded very different. And so young people that liked it had to learn from the players that were playing stride piano or, doing the steps, the cakewalk or whatever. And that was all being generated in the Black community, and it became a sort of fad and interest that became global. And so everyone in the Jewish and the American Songbook all grew up in Harlem. Gershwin, Richard Rodgers, Oscar Hammerstein, Loren Hart. They either went to Columbia or City College. And if I look at that period of ragtime, I see they were the bridge builders to the jazz culture back and forth. Whether you look at music publishing, whether you look at illustration, and Hirschfeld lived in Harlem, the illustrator, and he engaged with other players, E. Sims Campbell, who was the illustrator. There's a lot of back and forth, and we're both outsider groups. So if you're coming to America and you're having the immigrant experience and feeling like an outsider, if at the beginning of the 20th century was about science and what the technology of the century was going to be, it was another spiritual side that people like artists and painters wanted to capture, and African Americans provided the spiritual side. And so the crafting of the American Songbook, if you look at it, really is finding out the early ballot box through music of what was the identity of all of us, or trying to find that common ground that defined all of us. And so the first American musical is Showboat. It's written by Edna Ferber, who's Jewish. It's made into a theater production by, I believe it's Oscar Hammerstein. But the character Julie is passing. That's the story about this African woman who's passing. But more Jews were passing in 1920 than African Americans. And they were in the room where it happens. They actually hear people say anti-Semitic comments. Do you speak up and let them know you're Jewish or you don't? So they're telling their own story through these African American players. It's the same imitation of life happens later on. But the writer there again is a Jewish woman, Fannie Hurst, and she had as her secretary, Zora Neale Hurston had worked for her and told some a lot of the stories that she's engaging in. She's drawing on stuff she knew from Zora Neale Hurston. So there was a lot of sharing, I think. And even as we look at the Israeli situation today, in Marcus Garvey came up with a flag and an anthem before he knew where he was going to go. But he was looking for to build empire somewhere outside of America. Theodore Herzl comes up with Zionism, and he comes up with a flag and looking for a place to go. Same time period. Both thinking if America doesn't work, where will our homeland be? And so my question when we engage about what's going on in Israel, that I can understand if Garvey had found a homeland for me, if I never went there, I would be supportive of it psychologically, that it needs to be there. But it can't be there at the expense of other people's freedom. And so that's the thing I understand about it. I understand the psychology wanting to be there, but you can never be there forever as a safe haven if you don't do to others the same way you want it to be treated. So it's not that I'm anti anybody, but some sort of kind of fairness is going to make that exist. And again, all this stuff is being talked about and percolating in Harlem discussions in in a different way, but back to the 1920s.
Wow. Thank you. Okay, so let me read the next one. Hello, John. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It seems to me that we don't have W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Duke Ellington, Sonny Rollins, James Baldwin, Malcolm X around in Harlem anymore. I mean, there seems to be a lack of such revolutionary thinkers today versus the 50s to 70s period, although they are earlier than the 50s, 70s period. As a historian, do you agree with this observation? And if even partially so, could you comment on the possible causes?
Well, I mean, you look at the current election cycle and what's going on. And in my growing up, you could be a Mother Teresa or Jonas Salk, who gave the vaccine away so it would wipe out polio. He didn't try to be a billionaire off of it. There's very few people in the culture today that the culture holds up for the good that they do. It's not good unless they monetized it. And so I just think thinking about what we value, we decide who our heroes are. We encourage and support people to elevate our culture, people we have respect for, who have a certain level of principle. And if we don't elevate those people, then we're not going to get those people. So it's just as much, it's just as much our cultural identity with things and, the Kardashians, all this like false value. It's like, what are they really contributing to the culture? And when we say we don't know people like that, then how are we engaging in the culture to find those people? I don't believe they're not out there. I just feel they're not being elevated the way we elevate some other things, other players.
That is sort of a mind-blowing thought, John, to think about what heroes we are missing, what people we haven't elevated that we should, who are pursuing their art in whatever way, like Faith,
she was inspired. I mean, she said her mother was a dressmaker and she did fashion shows and stuff. She said, my mother told me how I should stand to have a presence in the room, and how to sell your product. She was making clothes and she wanted to sell them, and so she had a certain way of how she presented with the quality of what she's done and all of that. So I don't want to be frustrated about the possibilities. I really believe the people are out there, but I just think we have to say we value that as a culture, and so some of it's on us.
Right. That's what I'm feeling. That's definitely what I feel with that.
Like I never take Uber, for
Yeah.
example, because to me that's slavery in the 21st century. It's the Uber guy always provided the company is the technology to connect. It's not his car, it's not his gas. He's not paying the guy's social security, he's not paying his insurance, he's not doing anything but collecting a premium off someone else's work. And so by me taking Uber, I forced the guy who had a medallion to jump out the window because he couldn't meet his obligation for something he thought would put his kid through college or whatever. That was a peer choice. We did this to each other. And so that's why I think we have to step back and think about like what sort of life do we want to share amongst one another, and not just go with what seems like the easy and convenient thing, because those things in that first wave knocks out the other player, and then you have no choice. Now you get an Uber if it rains, pay more. If 10,000 people want to come to that same spot to get an Uber, it's the competition drives up the price or whatever. You have no control, and I still don't think the driver is getting any fair shake out of that. It's costing us more. And maybe outside of New York, that's a convenient way to move people around. But in New York, it was to the detriment of a worker peer. And
Right. I also wanted to just talk about Marjorie Elliott a little bit.
Oh, I adore Marjorie Elliott.
Because I love her and she is amazing. For anyone who doesn't know Marjorie, can you talk a little bit about Marjorie and what she does every Sunday?
Well, every Sunday she had a son who died some years ago. And as part of her act of grieving, she decided she would open her house to music. She has another son who's a musician as well, who's there with her that plays as well. His name's escaping me. And but it's obviously here's somewhere where she is revered within her building, because most people say you can't have strangers buzzing in the building, whatever. But they know she's producing something really wonderful, and really, to document that, just think if someone has just been taking photographs of that over a certain period of time or did illustrations, that's a unique experience that global players have experienced. I'm sure down the pike you'll hear somebody that says, I was here from Japan and I went there and I started playing. There's people who are global players who come and sort of connect with that story about, music in an apartment and what a rent party must have been like and how you met this odd person. That's all happening in her apartment. She's regenerating a sort of aspect of engagement in music and, the visitor that's very unique. And I think people have, a certain scale, they have appreciated that. It would be great to see her get more funding and support. And you guys do a great concert with her every year at the mansion and all that. But I think there's other stories out there like that, but she's a wonderful example of someone, and she's not doing it for the money. She has like a host mentality. There's a kind of generosity of spirit. And so
She
there's
has a generosity of spirit all the time.
Mm-hmm.
When she plays, they play at the mansion on a monthly basis, but we don't advertise it because she doesn't want it to be a concert. She just wants to fill the house with music. And so it's just an added wonderful thing that people get.
And that's what makes it magical. I mean, I do a lot of tours, and I always tell tourists, if you're back here in the summer in New York, just go to the parks websites and things and see what's going on in the parks of New York. Because you just bring a blanket, a bottle of wine or a sandwich. You can sit there and you can be like any other New Yorker. And even if you talk another language, no one's going to pay any attention, because in New York, there's all kinds of languages. They all look at you and think, oh, you're a tourist. They're just going to think, you're a German that lives across the street or whatever. There's just so many languages spoken in the city that even the speaking another language is nothing that's going to make you stand out. And you'll have a really like her, like, coming to something and just stumbling on that. You come to see the house or whatever, and then sit in the yard and have that magical moment, or, her playing music and all that.
Yeah, she is somebody very much with that generosity of spirit that wants to make the world a better place through her music. But she also always says it does more for her than anything. She does it for herself because it is her way to grieve and her way to share, and I bring anybody that I can on a Sunday over there, and everyone I've brought has been
And then
pretty
for tourism,
blown
I have
away.
this thing about, Harlem deserves more traffic. I'd love to see more African Americans come to the community. But just like what she does, she says 4 o'clock on Sunday. At 4 o'clock on Sunday, if you came from Japan, it was only one person. Her apartment would be open. She'd be there to play music, and that's not consistent throughout the community. And if you really want visitorship and tourism, a kind of regularity, and so I'm sticking to that kind of regularity, because people plan things months in advance or whatever. You can't start something and not really keep it going in a rigorous way. So even the tours I've been doing for the Metropolitan Museum, they're very selective. They want the people to have a great experience, but it really is like a very difficult thing to get players to sort of meet the date and time you tell them have to be there. There's something, if you want certain things, there's a kind of rigor to being a host. I mean, tourism really is you're trusting another person's hosting abilities. They're going to book the bus, they're going to get you this and that, and you're riding on their reputation that they're going to deliver on the other side. And so if they've been burned on the other side, they're never going to recommend, because 25 people or 45 people on the bus are angry because they didn't get something or they got it late. 10 minutes for the restaurant means you're going to be late to get to the theater or something else. What you think is nothing, on one side of it isn't nothing on a schedule and all of that. And so it's been very hard for
We
the
know about that
community.
at the museum because we strive for consistency and openness as a host, if you will, for our guests. And we can always improve on that.
I'm not saying it particularly to you, but I'm saying that
Oh,
like
and I know.
but I think a lot of people talk about tourism and visitorship in Harlem and all of that, and I just think part of it is just understanding what other players do to nurture that visitorship, and there's a kind of like coming to a rigor about like they come to your restaurant, you can't just hand them the menu. They're prepared to spend $40 within that that budgeted trip, and so you have to have a meal that meets that, and some choices within that price range, and you should already have it figured out if you're a restaurant, and that's what you hand to anybody that wants to do a tour and come to your restaurant. But it's like starting over every time things change. It's very frustrating, because I really do value my reputation in terms of like visitorship and taking people places and all of that, and so all that's part and parcel for me as a host, in terms of being, even the way we sweat it out before the talk, about the technology and like what I can do and what I can't do and all that. But I think about the audience and what they would like to have, and it's important. And Marjorie's the same, and she's very rigorous about the standards she sets.
Yep. Well, we are at 8:03, so we got time. I want to thank you so much for sharing your worldview, really, of Harlem and all of those different I feel like all those different rivers that have come together to create the influences that we feel today. And maybe we need to do a little bit more digging and find some more folks that we can pay attention to.
I mean, a lot of what I talked about, I really learned through the exercise I was doing with the prior director there in terms of looking at the legacy of players. And so a lot of the Morris-Jumel and those things I really learned through information that your institution sort of brought forward. So.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. All right, folks, we are going to end our evening. We want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts and questions. And again, I want to thank John Reddick for sharing his ideas. And you can recommend this to anyone else by sharing the recording. It will be on our website soon, and then it will be permanently on our YouTube channel. Thank you all very much for joining us, and have a lovely rest of your Wednesday evening. Good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.